contagious. I think I've come down with you. You remind me of my purpose, and to live with open arms. Love is deeper than the surface. You're the one that I lean on. I love you, and I see you. So I love you, and I see you. Hey, love you. I see you. So I love you, and I see you.
Our theme this month is Native, and here to talk about it is Mr. Michael Walker. He is a visual artist, writer, and musician. It's not enough to be just one of those, man. You had to go take all three. He's a native Texan, having grown up in the High Plains, where he believes so much great art comes from. He's an avid meditator, runner, reader, Spanish speaker, and a proud progressive Texan. He's played in many groups around town, the Photo Electric, Ghost Bunny, but currently you can find him under the handle Dead Scientist, where he, I think, does all the instruments, right?
That's another weird band.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, is it? Okay. So you can just find him under Michael Walker or M. Walker. What I love about Michael is he also gets to MC. He gets to do what I do, but probably better at a festival for John Prine out in Marathon, Texas every year. So he's a real man of music. But he's also a man of nature. He's a member of the Artists for Wild Nature program, which is also has a project called Project Coyote. And it's all about advocacy to encourage the peaceful coexistence with predator species, not just like butterflies, predator species like coyotes, bears, wolves, etc. He does also some work in the science communication space, helping organizations leverage artists' narrative to communicate important ideas, because scientists, as we know, are not necessarily the most intuitive storytellers. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just not their thing. So here to share his thoughts on the intersection of creativity and native, please help me in welcoming Michael Walker. There you go, you're gonna take up that. There.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. I got a taco. And I've reached the sweaty phase of my caffeination journey today, which is a lot of fun. Anybody else feeling sweaty? Yeah? It's okay, this is a safe place. Thanks so much for having me. This is my first time here at Creative Mornings, and speaking at your first one feels a bit like strapping a rocket to your chest and just seeing how it goes, but here we go. The idea of native was an interesting exercise to contemplate, like the creative work that I do and how it might intersect or how to pull that thread through it. So I think to start, I'll just give you a little bit of background. That's me. I blew up that TV shortly after this photo was taken. This is at the John Prine birthday party that we throw every year in Marathon. So if you like John Prine's music and you enjoy Big Bend, we're doing it again. It'll be our 5th year, October 12th. It's free and it's absurd, and there will be food and alcohol, and it'll be a really good time. So hope to see you out there. Indeed, I do a lot of different things, and I don't think it's because of any particular like willpower or discipline. I just have ADHD, and I heard someone recently describe that as hyper-focused dysregulation, and I think that's a much better description of it, because that's certainly how I feel. It's like, this is what I'm gonna focus on until I can't anymore, and then suddenly you can put that on a CV and it looks good. So I grew up in Amarillo. I was born just outside of Amarillo in a small town called Canyon. This map actually it was drawn by a good friend of mine, Matt Tumlinson. He's a phenomenal artist. You've probably run into his murals in small corners across Texas. He made this map, and it's hanging in my kitchen. And I just thought it was so great, because this is sort of the vibe that I grew up with. My dad worked in cattle. Mom's a teacher. Parents, grandparents, farmers in small towns across the Texas Panhandle. And you know, like you could take native in the direction of talking about native peoples and like my ancestors being colonial settlers, and that gets really dark really fast. And we're going to get a little dark later on, but I'm gonna lightly touch on it. So kind of taking it from a broader perspective, I think generally when we contemplate the idea of native, we think about land. And the land where I grew up is really special. I don't know how many of you have ever been to the Texas Panhandle. It can feel flat, right? Actually, is anybody here from Amarillo or the Panhandle? One? Oh, your husband's from Borger. Wow, okay. Anybody been through the Panhandle? I'd like to congratulate all of you for making it out. I'm kidding. That's how I felt most of my life growing up there. It was like, this is a desolate place. There's no culture here. What am I doing here? And got to San Marcos and Austin as quick as I could for school, and haven't really looked back, at least not as a place to live, but it has become the sole fascination and focus of my creative work. What appears to be flat on the surface is actually just a giant inverted mountain. Paladero Canyon, Toole Canyon, Caprock Canyon, all of that same canyon system that lines the Llano Estacado. It's actually the second largest canyon system in the United States, next to the Grand Canyon, and a lot of people don't know that. But it is just a beautiful place. And the more that I started to wrestle with this idea of home as I was growing up, like, what is it that I call home? The childhood house I live in doesn't exist anymore. I don't have a lot of connections beyond just my family in the Texas Panhandle anymore. My friends are all here and scattered across the globe. But what I keep coming back to is this sense of place that Amarillo and the surrounding area gave me. This soils and just the scale of time that the canyon walls tell is phenomenal, and it's a beautiful place to spend some time. So if you ever get a chance, I highly encourage it. Actually, this was around 2020, right towards the end of 2020, I took a trip up to Paladero Canyon because I was losing my mind in my tiny little house here in Austin, and went on a run and realized when I was running, I had this constant exercise as a kid. I was like, what would this place have been like before people? And I used to kind of play that game as you're driving, right? If you're not playing the license plate game with your siblings. And I didn't actually know for a very long time what the Panhandle looked like before people were there. And it wasn't until I started reading more natural history that I realized that the canyon was full of not just what O'Keeffe called a seething cauldron filled with dramatic light and color. And by the way, she taught at the university up in the Panhandle called West Texas A&M. We can get into a debate about what West Texas means later. It's very confusing and no one has the right answer. But she was absolutely right. It's filled with just these magnificent palettes of color that are impossible to recreate. It's a unique place. It's a unique setting. The textures, when you start manipulating them, are just so beautiful. And so as the canyon started to kind of work its way into my creative thinking, that run really inspired this idea to dig into the history and realize that it's not just color, it's not just this sort of state park quality place. It used to be filled with the same kinds of animals that you might expect to see at Yellowstone, for example, right? There were bison, there were grizzly bears, there were elk, there were moose, there were wolves, there were coyotes. It was teeming, and if you read some of the early reports of this, when the American settlers really started looking at this, kind of Lewis and Clark era, they describe it as impossibly vast, not just with grass, but also with animals. And that kind of biomass and diversity is completely gone now. And it happened in a very short amount of time. And so that idea kind of haunted me, started doodling around with some things, and came to this point where I really wanted to create a story around that, and I wasn't sure what it was, but it wound up being an album, and this is from the cover of that album, and it's called Canyon Illuminant. And so the concept was that I would take little vignettes, musical vignettes that zoomed in on a scenario with any one of those animals, right? And so there's no words in this music, it's instrumental, and it's pretty weird, and I think you'll really like it, and I'll link to it at the end. This one was a pretty simple instrumentation, actually. It was more or less like an acoustic guitar, some drums, some bass, some synthesizer, and piano. And that really was a fun palette of colors to play with from a musical perspective. And it was entirely about the canyon. And I think it really does create a sense of place when you hear it in context. So if you do go to Palo Duro Canyon, this is a great thing to pop on as you drive down from the rim. And this actually was a really cool thing, because after I put the album out, I managed to connect with a guy named Dan Flores. He's written some really great books. I think his most popular one is called Coyote America, if you've never heard of it. Wonderful read. We've been corresponding ever since I put this album out. And I guess he spent some time in the Panhandle teaching at Texas Tech, and he's a big advocate now for predator species as well. So he got me involved with Project Coyote, as Ben was describing, which is a great organization. They do a lot of advocacy and policy work primarily, and they have this sort of this interesting arm of the organization that has like no rules whatsoever, where they find artists and creatives who are interested in also doing advocacy work and communicating the importance of it through art. And so they kind of let me do what I want. I write for them sometimes, and then we do social media things, which feels strange, but it actually does create a lot of interesting dialogue and conversation. There's the QR code if you want to check them out. Really, really cool organization. So that wasn't the end of my journey with the canyon from a musical perspective. I was really interested in looking at the history of that place, right? So we kind of dived into prehistory, and I wanted to take a look at, well, what significant events have actually happened here? And one of the most tragic events, I think, that happened here is called the Red River War. For those of you who aren't super familiar with Texas history, this was one of the last military conflicts between the Southern Plains tribes and the United States Army. And it has some pretty wild characters on both sides of the wars, or the battles that took place in that war. If you're interested in diving into a historical topic that you might not have expected to encounter today, this is a pretty wild one. And the idea behind this album was very similar. I wanted to tell the stories about the people that were involved in this, and sort of how they were contextualized by the canyons where many of those battles took place. And that led to some interesting kind of animated paintings that I was playing around with. And I tend to start with these sort of visuals just to kind of get a sense for like, what do I want this to feel like? And then the music itself was very similar in the approach. I wanted to do an instrumental, kind of abstract, vignette style piece of music. And this time I wanted to expand the sonic palette a bit too, and be a bit more ambitious. So I wound up actually incorporating a lot more pretty raucous guitars. I actually worked with a chamber orchestra, different players across the state. It was kind of wild. We were doing like asynchronous symphonic recording. So we were passing files back and forth. I'd send them sheets and they'd be like, hey, this is terrible, try this instead. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. And we did all sorts of abstract kind of playing techniques on some of the string and flutes on this album. So it wound up being, I think, the piece of music that I'm the most proud of. It's really insane, and it's a very niche. I think like the PBS crowd is probably my listener base. Which, if that makes sense to you, you understand what I mean. So I'm actually in talks with PBS right now. They, Texas Parks and Wildlife has a really great show, and they're starting this series that looks at artists in Texas who are inspired by Texas land. And so we're going to go film some of this music in the canyon, which I think will be really fun. I don't know when that's going to happen because I'm about to have a kid. Thank you. I've done all the work. Yeah, and but we're gonna get out there and film it. And how many of you know who Walker Lukens is? Artist here in town? Yeah, that idiot. He's a good friend of mine. We're going to the Austin FC game tomorrow. If you see us, come say hi. But he's started putting on this wonderful show at the Paramount Theater in December called The Last Waltz. If any of you were there last year, you probably saw me do some of the weirdest performance art you may have encountered in a while, and you're welcome. But next December, I'll be actually performing some of the work from these albums with a string section, so it should be a lot of fun. I've never done it live, so it'll be a wild time. moving on, for the sake of time, I want to dive into kind of another aspect of my creative practice that's not one I really practice publicly. I don't have a gallery. I'm not trying to get into shows, but it's a really important part of my life and meditation practice, and that's Ikebana. For those of you who haven't encountered it, it's a traditional style of Japanese flower arranging. And there are many schools of Ikebana. I sort of practice in a few of them, and I really love the art form. It's a wonderful way to be contemplative. And when I started learning Ikebana, it was striking to me how much of an exercise in just studying form it was. It's really a great way to start seeing constituent parts in a different context and tie them together in an arrangement. And primarily I was working with just flowers that you might find at Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, flower shops. And that was great. It was a really cool way to learn how to do this practice. And I had some great teachers as I started out this journey. And then over time, I got less and less interested in flowers from the grocery store, primarily because I'm quite allergic to a lot of them, and it was just a disastrous experience keeping arrangements in the house. Particularly marigolds, which are related to ragweed. If you didn't know, there you go. So just to kind of give you a sense for it, one of the primary driving principles of Ikebana is this sense of place, this sense of season, this sense of temporality. And that was just so a part of my musical and visual art practice that it made sense for me to start tying it back to land as well. And I weirdly got invited by the International Soil Sciences Academy to go practice Ikebana and give a talk at their national conference in Baltimore a few years ago. And I said, well, let's do some Ikebana that incorporates crops, right? Because there's a bunch of agronomists there and aspects of land that might not typically happen in Ikebana because it's primarily a Japanese art form, and you don't see a lot of American plants in those arrangements. And so I actually went to the expo floor where all of these soil scientists were kind of walking around very hurriedly, looking at different tractors and combines. And I got to practice Ikebana in front of them, and it was so hilarious. This is kind of mid arrangement. So hilarious because they're like, "What are you doing?" And it was a great way to start this is a really badly cropped version of what kind of wound up being. But it was I wound up spending, I think, probably 4 hours doing this, and it took that long because people just kept coming up and talking about it. And we got to explore these ideas of why it's so important to take care of soil, right? The implications are as big as climate change, and whether or not we get to eat food at the end of the day. And so it was a really fantastic way to bring creativity into the conversation and infuse some ideas about how they can communicate the importance of their work through creative practice, and it all ties back to land. I got invited to do Ikebana at a friend's wedding as well, and they got married out in the hill country, and it was a beautiful ranch covered in live and post oak. And so I said, that's an interesting idea. Let's play with that. And so I wound up actually incorporating a lot of the elements of live oaks in the arrangements. And so it felt like it just sort of naturally blended in with the environment, like it had always been there. But it was very clearly curated. And here's another badly cropped version of one of the arrangements that I did there. So that was a lot of fun. Moving on quickly, we've got about 4 minutes left. I'm currently working on, how many of you are familiar with this view? Anybody been out to Big Bend? Hiked the rim? Yeah, phenomenal. Beautiful place. So I mentioned my friend Sam has a grocery store in Marathon where we throw that John Prine party. If you're ever at his grocery store, stop and say hello, tell him I sent you. Maybe he'll give you a cookie. We spend a lot of time in Big Bend, and I've become obsessed with this plant that you see everywhere. It's quite ubiquitous. You can see it in this photo, even at high elevation. And here is a close-up image of it with some of the seeds. It's the creosote bush. It smells wonderful when it rains, right? Some people will even clip them and hang them next to their shower so it rehydrates over and over again. But it eventually will turn black and just kind of look nasty hanging on your wall. You're like, are you a witch? What is this? But over the years, I've become just increasingly obsessed with this and started interviewing a lot of different scientists about the impact that it's had and how it's spread, because it's not naturally as pervasive as you see it now in West Texas. A lot of overgrazing practices have led to wider spread prevalence of creosote bush and to the detriment of the grasslands that actually sustains so much biodiversity in the Big Bend area. And so I'm writing whoops, that's the end of my talk. Thank you for coming. That's okay, I can get back. So yeah, I'm writing a monograph actually called Creosote on Everything. It started out, I asked a friend, I was like, hey, can I write an essay and maybe have you look at it, publishing it? And she was like, sure. And then I was like, hey, it's a book, I'm sorry, we can't do this. So I can't stop writing about creosote, and eventually I'm gonna have to start paring back, but it's really cool to learn about this region. And like, I never would have ever thought that creosote was a thread that pulled through all of this, but land is so essential and central to life in the Big Bend area. And really understanding what this plant means and what it means for the future, I think is very important. So hopefully I'll tell a good story. I'm also working on another book. This one I started in college. I don't know if I'll ever finish it, probably won't. But it's a pretty surreal mystery with murder and other things. If you like David Lynch and cowboys, you might really enjoy this book. But it so ties into land. It is a central character in the story beyond just the human beings that are portrayed. And that's more or less the end of my talk. So all of this concept of native, I wanted to leave you with the idea that it relates back to land. So next time you're out in the Greenbelt, next time you're at Barton Springs, Town Lake, whatever you're doing, it's Town Lake, by the way. That's what it's called. If you don't think that, we can fight after. Really pay attention to the land. See what kind of story it tells for you, and maybe think about where you grew up and what story that land tells. It's a powerful, powerful vehicle to carry a message. And that's it. So this is me. If you like QR codes, it's there. My website is sleepyburrito.com. And as Jeb Bush would say, please clap.